The sound of coffee splashing across classified documents made every head in the Pentagon war room turn toward the small woman standing frozen by the tactical display. "Coffee's over there, sweetheart," Captain Blake Morrison sneered, his massive frame blocking her path to the briefing table. "This isn't a bring-your-daughter-to-work day." The room erupted in snickers as Skylar Cross, barely 5'4", in her oversized military green t-shirt and faded combat boots, clutched a stack of analysis reports against her chest. Her long neon blue hair was pulled back in a messy bun, loose strands framing her fair porcelain face dotted with natural freckles. Admiral Thorne, seated at the head of the massive oak conference table, barely glanced up from his satellite feeds. "Who let the intern into a classified briefing?" he muttered, his weathered hands dismissively waving toward the door. Around the table, 12 of the Pentagon's most elite tactical officers watched with barely concealed amusement as this quiet analyst stood paralyzed among the war maps and encrypted communications equipment. The massive screens displayed real-time global threat assessments, while red emergency lights cast harsh shadows across her defined cheekbones. I'm supposed to be here," Skylar whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of electronic surveillance systems. Blake laughed harshly, stepping closer until his shadow completely engulfed her small frame. "Sure you are, kid, and I'm the president." But in exactly 18 minutes, when those analysis reports revealed what was hidden beneath her quiet exterior, every single person in that room would understand they had just made the biggest tactical error of their military careers. What they were about to witness would redefine everything they thought they knew about command authority. The tension in the war room was thick enough to cut with a knife as Admiral Thorne finally looked up from his intelligence briefings, his steel-gray eyes sweeping across the assembled officers before landing on Skylar with obvious irritation. "Since we apparently have unauthorized personnel in this classified briefing," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in command, "let's establish some basic protocol. Everyone state your call sign and clearance level." The responses came in crisp military precision around the table. "Falcon 2, top secret SCI," announced Major Reeves from the communications station. "Thunder 7, top secret," called out Staff Sergeant Cooper from his position near the satellite feeds. One by one, the officers identified themselves with the confident bearing of men and women who had earned their positions through years of dedicated service and proven competence under fire. Blake leaned back in his chair with a predatory grin, clearly anticipating the moment when this obvious imposter would be exposed and humiliated. When the ritual reached Skylar, she stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats, her green eyes darting briefly to each face around the table before settling on Admiral Thorne's expectant stare. "Shadow," she said quietly, the single word barely rising above the ambient noise of cooling fans and electronic equipment. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds before the room exploded in laughter. Blake was the first to recover, slapping his hand on the table with enough force to make the coffee cups jump. "Shadow, that's rich. What's next, Ninja? Phantom?" His fellow officers joined in the mockery, their professional composure dissolving into the kind of cruel amusement that emerges when a group finds a common target for their collective frustration. Lieutenant Hayes, a sharp-featured woman with blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun, shook her head with theatrical disbelief. "Somebody's been watching too many action movies. Real operators don't pick names that sound like comic book characters." The cruel laughter continued as Admiral Thorne raised his hand for silence, his face showing a mixture of annoyance and resignation. "Miss Cross, I don't know what kind of security clearance you think you have, but this is a briefing for senior tactical staff only. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Skylar's grip tightened on her reports, her knuckles showing white against her pale skin, but she didn't move. "Admiral, my orders specifically assigned me to this briefing. Strategic Analysis Division, Level 4, clearance." Blake stood up slowly, his 6'3" frame unfolding like a threat made manifest. "Level 4? Kid, I've got Level 5 clearance and 20 years of active service. You look like you just graduated from college." The room's atmosphere grew more hostile by the second, the professional veneer of military courtesy, wearing thin as these battle-tested veterans faced what they perceived as an obvious fraud. If you're already hooked by this story of hidden military power, smash that like button right now and subscribe for more incredible tales of undercover operators. Trust me, what Shadow does in the next few minutes will make you question everything you think you know about who really runs military operations. The payoff is absolutely worth it. Captain Blake Morrison had spent 23 years climbing the military hierarchy, earning his position through a combination of ruthless ambition and genuine tactical competence. His service record included 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, and a reputation for crushing anyone who threatened his carefully constructed image of invincibility. Standing before this small woman with her nervous demeanor and ridiculous blue hair, he felt the familiar surge of dominance that had served him well throughout his career. "Prove you belong here," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "Tell us something about current operations that only someone with real clearance would know." The challenge hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, and every eye in the room focused on Skylar with predatory intensity. Staff Sergeant Cooper, a veteran of multiple overseas deployments who had learned to read people under the extreme stress of combat situations, found himself studying the young woman's reaction with professional interest. While her hands continued their subtle trembling, her feet had automatically shifted into what looked suspiciously like a combat stance, weight distributed evenly, ready to move in any direction. It was such a subtle adjustment that most people would have missed it entirely, but Cooper had spent too many years in environments where recognizing threats meant the difference between coming home alive or in a body bag. The confrontation might have escalated further, but Lieutenant Hayes chose that moment to make her move. With the practiced precision of someone who had spent years manipulating situations to her advantage, she reached across the table and switched 2 of Skylar's analysis folders while maintaining perfect eye contact with Admiral Thorne. "Since we're testing credentials," Hayes said smoothly, "why don't we see if our analyst can handle a simple briefing organization task? These reports need to be arranged in proper tactical sequence." It was a subtle sabotage designed to create confusion and embarrassment without leaving fingerprints on the crime. Hayes had learned long ago that the most effective way to destroy someone's credibility was to make them destroy it themselves. Skylar glanced down at the folders, and for just a moment, something shifted in her expression. The nervous uncertainty flickered like a candle in the wind, replaced by something harder and more calculating. Without apparent effort, she rearranged the documents in perfect chronological and tactical order, her movements precise and economical. She hadn't looked at the contents. She had simply recognized the subtle differences in paper weight, ink color, and classification stamps that indicated the proper sequence. It was the kind of skill that came from years of handling classified materials under pressure, but none of the watching officers recognized it for what it was. Major Reeves had been observing the interaction with growing unease, his instincts honed by 15 years of special operations, telling him that something fundamental was wrong with this picture. When Skylar had entered the war room, he had automatically noted her movement pattern, the way she unconsciously maintained tactical spacing between herself and potential threat points, the micro adjustments in her posture that suggested someone trained to evaluate and respond to hostile environments. These weren't conscious behaviors that could be learned from books or movies. They were ingrained responses that came from real experience in situations where failure to maintain proper awareness could prove fatal. His observation was interrupted by Blake's escalating aggression as the captain stepped closer to Skylar, using his superior size and military bearing to create psychological pressure. "Coffee girl doesn't get tactical clearance," Blake announced, his voice loud enough to carry beyond the immediate circle of confrontation. "I don't care what paperwork you're carrying or what lies you've been told. This briefing is for real military professionals, not wannabes playing dress-up." The insults continued to rain down on Skylar like artillery fire, each comment designed to strip away another layer of dignity and credibility. Tech specialist Morgan, monitoring multiple intelligence feeds from his position at the main console, found his attention divided between his official duties and the growing drama unfolding behind him. Despite his focus on the electronic warfare systems, he couldn't help but notice how Skylar's eyes automatically tracked the information flowing across the various screens, her gaze moving in patterns that suggested she was processing and analyzing the data, rather than simply staring at pretty lights. When a fragment of classified operational code appeared briefly on one of the secondary monitors, Morgan saw her lips move silently, as if she were completing a sequence that the system had only partially displayed. It was such a subtle reaction that he almost convinced himself he had imagined it, but the precision of her apparent knowledge nagged at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Admiral Thorne, growing increasingly irritated by the disruption to his carefully scheduled briefing, finally decided to put an end to the circus. Miss Cross, I appreciate whatever enthusiasm brought you here, but this briefing requires security clearances that take years to obtain and verify. I'm going to have to insist that you report to your supervisor for proper assignment. The dismissal was delivered with the kind of finality that had ended countless military careers. But before Schuyler could respond, the war room's emergency alert system activated with a sound like the world ending. Red lights began flashing throughout the facility as the primary threat display switched from routine monitoring to active crisis mode. The massive central screen filled with incoming data streams, showing a coordinated attack on multiple Allied installations across 3 different time zones. Every officer in the room immediately shifted into crisis management mode, their personal conflicts forgotten in the face of a genuine threat to national security. Admiral Thorne's voice cut through the chaos with practiced authority. All stations report. What are we looking at? The responses came in rapid succession as each specialist focused on their area of expertise. Multiple drone swarms approaching forward operating base Centaur, called out Major Reeves from the satellite communications station. Enemy electronic warfare systems are jamming standard countermeasures, added Morgan from his position at the cyber warfare console. Estimated time to contact, 12 minutes and counting. Staff Sergeant Cooper pulled up defensive protocols on his screen, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he attempted to coordinate a response. Standard defensive measures are showing zero effectiveness, Admiral. Whatever they're using, it's not in our threat database. The gravity of the situation settled over the room like a heavy blanket, each officer recognizing the signs of a carefully planned and executed attack that had been designed to overwhelm their conventional responses. Blake, determined to maintain his position of authority even in the face of genuine crisis, assigned Schuyler the most menial task he could think of. "Since you are so eager to help," he said with obvious condescension, "you can file these situation reports while the real professionals handle the actual emergency." He thrust a stack of classified documents toward her, expecting to see her crumble under the pressure of being marginalized during such a critical moment. Instead, Schuyler accepted the papers with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the confrontation, settling into a corner position where she could observe the unfolding crisis without interfering with the primary operators. From her vantage point, she began to notice patterns in the incoming data that the focused specialists were missing, connections between seemingly unrelated events that suggested a level of coordination and intelligence that went far beyond simple terrorist tactics. While the officers struggled with jammed communications and ineffective countermeasures, she quietly pulled out a worn paper map and a basic compass, tools that seemed almost primitive in the high-tech environment of the war room. Schuyler's comprehensive situation analysis relied on advanced tablet technology, featuring military-grade processing capabilities and satellite connectivity systems originally developed for battlefield commanders. The ruggedized device included encrypted communication protocols, real-time intelligence gathering, and tactical mapping software that enabled split-second strategic decisions even in the most challenging operational environments where standard civilian electronics would completely fail under pressure. The crisis continued to escalate as Admiral Thorne received increasingly desperate reports from field commanders who were watching their defensive systems fail in real time. "Admiral, we're looking at a total communications blackout in Sector 7, reported Major Reeves, his usual calm beginning to crack under the pressure. "Whatever jamming technology they're using, it's beyond anything we've encountered before." Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring diplomatic channels, added her own grim assessment. "Sir, Allied forces are requesting immediate support, but our standard response protocols aren't designed for this level of coordinated electronic warfare." The weight of command pressed down on Admiral Thorne like a physical force, as he realized that 30 years of military experience might not be enough to handle this unprecedented threat. Blake, desperate to maintain his image of competence, offered increasingly aggressive solutions that focused on brute force rather than tactical finesse. "Admiral, we should authorize immediate drone strikes on suspected enemy positions. Overwhelm them with superior firepower before they can complete their objectives." Staff Sergeant Cooper shook his head grimly. "Sir, we can't even locate their command structure through all this electronic interference. Blind strikes would be as likely to hit our own people as enemy targets." As the situation deteriorated further, Schuyler quietly began working with her primitive tools, using the paper map to calculate intercept vectors and defensive positions that didn't rely on compromised electronic systems. Her movements were precise and economical, the nervous trembling that had characterized her earlier interactions replaced by the focused intensity of someone who had faced similar crises before. Using only basic mathematical principles and a deep understanding of tactical geometry, she began to identify patterns in the enemy attack that the computer-dependent officers were missing. The key insight came when she realized that the electronic jamming wasn't random interference, but a carefully orchestrated symphony designed to create specific blind spots in the Allied defensive network. By plotting these blind spots on her paper map, she could see the true scope and intention of the enemy's strategy, information that would be crucial for developing an effective response. Major Reeves, glancing over at her improvised workspace, noticed the precise tactical markings she was making and felt a familiar chill of recognition. Those weren't the random scribblings of an amateur trying to look important. They were the methodical calculations of someone who understood the deadly mathematics of modern warfare. Blake's frustration reached a boiling point as his conventional solutions continued to prove inadequate against the enemy's sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. "This is ridiculous. We're the most technologically advanced military in the world, and we're being beaten by jammers and drones." His voice carried a note of panic that he tried unsuccessfully to mask with aggressive bravado. Admiral Thorne, feeling the weight of hundreds of lives hanging in the balance, made a decision that went against every instinct developed over decades of military hierarchy. "I want options from everyone in this room," he announced. "I don't care about rank or protocol. If anyone has ideas that might save our people, I need to hear them now." The admission of desperation hung in the air like a confession of failure, but it also opened a door that had been firmly closed since the briefing began. Skylar looked up from her map calculations, and for the first time since entering the war room, she spoke with something approaching confidence. "Admiral, there's a radar blind spot at Grid 47 Alpha," she said quietly, pointing to a specific location on the main tactical display. "If you can route survivors to that position, they'll have cover from the jamming effects." The precision of her observation sent a shock through the assembled officers, not because of what she said, but because of what her knowledge implied. Share this video with someone who's ever been underestimated at work. The skills Skylar is about to demonstrate will blow your mind. Hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss how this tactical showdown unfolds. Major Reeves immediately pulled up the satellite imagery for the coordinates Skylar had indicated, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. What appeared on the screen made him pause, his military training recognizing the significance of what he was seeing. "Holy cow," he breathed, staring at the data. "She's right. There's a natural formation there that would block line-of-sight jamming, but how did she know that?" The question hung unanswered as Admiral Thorne processed the implications of an analyst demonstrating knowledge that should have been impossible for someone with her apparent background and clearance level. Blake, desperate to maintain his position of authority, immediately attempted to diminish the significance of her contribution. "Lucky guess," he declared, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Anyone looking at those coordinates might have spotted the same thing." Staff Sergeant Cooper, however, was studying Skylar with renewed interest, his combat-hardened instincts telling him that luck had nothing to do with what they had just witnessed. He had worked with enough intelligence analysts to recognize the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience, and everything about her observation suggested someone who had faced similar tactical problems before. The enemy attack continued to intensify as reports flooded in from multiple threatened positions, each message painting a grimmer picture of the scope and sophistication of the assault. "Admiral, Forward Operating Base Centaur is requesting immediate evacuation assistance," called out Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring emergency communications channels. "They have wounded personnel who can't be moved using standard extraction protocols." Admiral Thorne felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions, the burden that came with holding lives in balance while working with incomplete information and inadequate resources. Skylar, still working quietly with her paper maps and basic calculations, suddenly looked up with an expression of urgent intensity. "There's an unorthodox flanking maneuver that could work," she said, her voice growing stronger as she focused on the tactical problem rather than the social dynamics of the room. "If you approach from bearing 270 degrees and use terrain masking to avoid the primary jamming fields, you can establish a corridor for extraction." The suggestion was delivered with the kind of casual precision that suggested extensive familiarity with advanced tactical concepts, causing several officers to exchange meaningful glances. Tech specialist Morgan, monitoring multiple intelligence feeds while trying to track the source of the enemy jamming signals, found himself increasingly fascinated by the analytical approach this supposed amateur was taking to solve problems that were stumping his sophisticated electronic systems. When she mentioned specific bearing calculations and terrain masking techniques, he realized she was using terminology that was typically restricted to special operations planning documents. "Miss Cross," he said carefully, "where exactly did you learn about terrain masking protocols?" The question carried implications that went far beyond casual curiosity, suggesting that her knowledge might represent a significant security breach if she had obtained classified information through unauthorized channels. Skylar's response was to meet his gaze directly for the first time since entering the war room, her green eyes showing a clarity and confidence that hadn't been visible during her earlier nervous interactions. "Experience," she said simply, the single word carrying more weight than a detailed explanation. Lieutenant Hayes, who had been monitoring various intelligence databases while tracking the ongoing crisis, suddenly announced that she was conducting a background verification check on all personnel present, ostensibly as a security protocol, but actually as an attempt to expose what she assumed would be fraudulent credentials. Blake, sensing an opportunity to reassert his dominance and expose what he remained convinced was an elaborate deception, moved closer to Skylar's improvised workspace. "Stop pretending to be something you're not," he said, his voice carrying the kind of menace that had intimidated countless subordinates throughout his career. "Real tactical officers don't work with paper maps and pocket compasses. They use million-dollar computer systems and satellite networks." He reached out to grab her shoulder, intending to physically remove her from the area where the actual professionals were trying to save lives. The gesture was meant to be dismissive and humiliating, a public demonstration that this apparent fraud had no place among genuine military personnel. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed in classified briefings for years to come, though the official records would never fully capture the moment when everything everyone thought they knew about the quiet analyst named Skylar Cross was revealed to be spectacularly wrong. As Blake's hand descended toward her shoulder, expecting to encounter the submissive compliance of someone caught in an elaborate lie, the emergency in the field reached a critical point that demanded immediate and decisive action from someone with the knowledge and authority to save lives hanging in the balance. The communications array suddenly crackled with desperate field reports as the situation at Forward Operating Base Centaur deteriorated beyond the point where conventional rescue protocols could be effective. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Centaur Base," came the static-filled transmission. "We have multiple casualties and are taking heavy fire. Standard evacuation routes are compromised. Request immediate tactical support or will be overrun within the hour." Admiral Thorne found himself facing the kind of impossible decision that had haunted military commanders throughout history, weighing the lives of those under his command against the limitations of available resources and intelligence. Major Reeves, coordinating with multiple field units while trying to establish reliable communications through the enemy jamming, announced grimly that all conventional rescue scenarios were showing unacceptable casualty projections. "Sir, we're looking at a potential loss of 200 personnel if we proceed with standard extraction protocols," he reported, his voice tight with professional frustration. "The enemy jamming is too sophisticated for our current countermeasures to penetrate effectively." Staff Sergeant Cooper added his own bleak assessment from the tactical analysis station. "Admiral, enemy forces have established overlapping fields of fire that cover all approaches to the base. They knew exactly where to position their assets to neutralize our standard responses. The realization that they were facing an enemy with detailed knowledge of Allied tactical procedures added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation." Blake, still reaching toward Skylar's shoulder with the intention of removing her from the crisis management area, found his motion interrupted as the war room's emergency protocols activated at the highest level. Automated systems began locking down all non-essential access points, while emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the faces of officers who were beginning to understand that they might be witnessing a historic military disaster. Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring classified communication channels, suddenly announced that multiple Allied installations were reporting similar coordinated attacks, suggesting a level of enemy preparation and intelligence that went far beyond anything in their current threat assessments. "Admiral, this isn't a random terrorist action," she said, her voice carrying a note of barely controlled alarm. Someone with access to our operational procedures has been feeding information to hostile forces. We're dealing with a systematic betrayal of classified protocols. The scope of the security breach began to sink in, as each officer realized that their most closely guarded tactical procedures had been compromised at the highest levels. During high-stakes military operations, specialized insurance policies provide comprehensive coverage for personnel involved in classified assignments and tactical decision-making roles. These premium programs include liability protection for command decisions, comprehensive health coverage for stress-related conditions, and financial security packages designed specifically for military families facing the unique challenges of classified operational deployments and career uncertainties. Admiral Thorne, feeling the weight of command crushing down on him like a physical force, made a decision that violated every principle of military hierarchy he had followed throughout his career. "I need solutions from anyone who has them," he announced, his voice carrying the desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "I don't care about clearance levels or proper channels. If someone in this room has knowledge that can save those people, I need to hear it now." The admission represented a fundamental breakdown of the command structure that had defined his entire professional identity, but it also opened possibilities that strict adherence to protocol would have prevented. Skylar, who had been quietly working with her primitive tools while the electronic systems failed around her, suddenly stepped forward with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested someone transitioning from observation to action. "Admiral," she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that hadn't been present during her earlier nervous interactions. "I can get them out, but you're not going to like my methods." The transformation in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, the uncertain analyst replaced by someone who spoke with the confidence of proven experience. Blake's hand was still reaching toward her shoulder when Skylar moved, not to avoid his contact, but to access the main tactical console, with movements that were too smooth and practiced to be coincidental. "What do you think you're doing?" Blake demanded, his voice rising with outrage as he realized she was attempting to interface with classified systems. "Unauthorized personnel are not permitted to access tactical networks." His objection carried all the weight of regulations and procedures that had governed his entire military career, but it fell into a void as Admiral Thorne faced the choice between following proper protocol and potentially saving lives that hung in the balance. Major Reeves, watching Skylar's interaction with the computer systems, noticed that her fingers moved across the keyboard with the kind of automatic precision that came from extensive familiarity with military interface protocols. "Sir," he said quietly to Admiral Thorne, "she knows the system architecture. That's not something you learn from technical manuals." Staff Sergeant Cooper, monitoring the incoming crisis reports while keeping one eye on the developing confrontation, found himself torn between his loyalty to established procedures and his growing conviction that this quiet analyst might possess knowledge that could make the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Skylar's access to the tactical networks revealed capabilities that shouldn't have existed on any analyst's credentials, as classified subroutines responded to her authentication codes with the kind of immediate compliance that suggested clearance levels far beyond anything she had claimed. Blake, watching in growing horror as she bypassed security protocols that should have been impenetrable, felt his worldview shifting like sand beneath his feet. "This is impossible," he muttered, staring at displays that were responding to commands from someone he had dismissed as an obvious fraud. "Those systems require clearances that take years to obtain and verify." Tech specialist Morgan, monitoring the network activity while trying to maintain his focus on the ongoing crisis, announced that her access credentials were being validated at levels he hadn't known existed. "Admiral, she's got authentication codes that are classified above my clearance level," he reported, his voice tight with professional confusion. "The system is recognizing her as an authorized user with tactical override capabilities." Lieutenant Hayes, who had been conducting background verification checks while monitoring the crisis communications, suddenly went very quiet as her search results began displaying information that challenged every assumption she had made about the woman standing at the tactical console. The moment of truth arrived as Skylar's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, inputting a series of override codes that should have been known only to a very select group of individuals with the highest possible security clearances. The tactical display responded immediately, showing detailed intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities that had been invisible to conventional surveillance systems. How do you know those codes? Blake demanded, his voice carrying a note of panic as he realized that his entire understanding of the situation had been fundamentally wrong. Admiral Thorne, watching classified information appear on screens that had shown only fragments and confusion moments before, felt a chill of recognition as patterns emerged that suggested knowledge and capabilities far beyond what any routine analyst should possess. Staff Sergeant Cooper, comparing the new intelligence with field reports that had seemed incomprehensible minutes earlier, announced that the tactical picture was finally beginning to make sense. "Sir, with this information, we can plot effective countermeasures against the enemy jamming," he reported, his voice showing the first note of hope since the crisis had begun. "But I need to know, where is this intelligence coming from?" The question hung in the air like an accusation as every eye in the war room focused on Skylar, who continued working at the tactical console with the kind of calm efficiency that suggested someone who had faced similar crises many times before. Blake, desperate to maintain some semblance of authority in a situation that was spiraling beyond his control, made a move that would prove to be the final mistake in a series of catastrophic misjudgments. "I don't care what tricks you've learned or what codes you've memorized," he snarled, reaching out to physically remove her from the console. "Unauthorized access to classified systems is a federal crime, and I'm placing you under arrest." His hand closed on the fabric of her military green t-shirt, intending to pull her away from the keyboard and reassert the proper order of military hierarchy. The gesture was meant to be decisive and authoritative, a clear demonstration that regulations and proper procedures could not be circumvented by clever deception or unauthorized knowledge. What Blake failed to anticipate was that some deceptions run deeper than anyone imagines, and that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves with devastating effect. As Blake's grip tightened on the fabric of Skylar's shirt, the tactical displays around them continued to update with intelligence that was transforming the entire strategic picture of the crisis. Admiral Thorne found himself torn between his ingrained respect for proper procedures and his growing recognition that this supposed analyst might possess capabilities that could mean the difference between saving lives and witnessing a catastrophic military disaster. Major Reeves, monitoring communications with the threatened base while trying to process the implications of what he was witnessing, announced that the enemy jamming was showing signs of systematic weakness that could be exploited if they had the right tactical approach. "Sir, if we can coordinate a response based on this new intelligence, we might be able to establish an extraction corridor," he reported, his voice carrying cautious optimism for the first time since the crisis had begun. Staff Sergeant Cooper, working frantically to update defensive protocols based on the information Skylar had accessed, found himself asking questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about security clearances and operational authority. "Admiral, the intelligence she's accessing is classified at levels that don't appear in standard databases," he said carefully. "I think we need to consider the possibility that there is more to this situation than we initially understood." The war room had become a pressure cooker of competing loyalties and impossible decisions as the crisis in the field demanded immediate action, while the revelation of unauthorized capabilities raised questions that went to the heart of military security protocols. Lieutenant Hayes, still monitoring her background verification searches, suddenly announced results that sent a shock through the assembled officers. "Admiral, her service record shows gaps that are classified beyond my access level," she reported, her voice showing the first signs of uncertainty since the confrontation had begun. "Most of her background information is redacted or unavailable through normal channels." Tech specialist Morgan, watching the flow of classified intelligence across his screens while trying to maintain focus on the tactical crisis, found himself confronting the uncomfortable possibility that everything they thought they knew about proper procedures and clearance levels might be incomplete. "Sir, the system logs are showing that her access codes predate the current security architecture," he announced, his voice tight with professional confusion. "These credentials were issued under protocols that I don't recognize." Blake's determination to maintain control of the situation reached a crescendo as he prepared to physically remove Skylar from the tactical console, his grip on her shirt tightening as he prepared to assert the authority that had defined his entire military career. "I don't care what kind of clearance you think you have," he declared, his voice rising above the ambient noise of electronic systems and emergency communications. "No analyst has the authority to override tactical command decisions during an active crisis. The confrontation represented more than a simple disagreement about procedures. It was a clash between rigid adherence to established hierarchy and the recognition that desperate situations sometimes required extraordinary measures. Admiral Thorne, watching the tactical displays continue to update with intelligence that could save hundreds of lives, felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical force as he prepared to make a decision that would define his legacy and determine the fate of the personnel under his protection. Staff Sergeant Cooper, monitoring field communications while keeping one eye on the developing confrontation, announced that the threatened base was requesting immediate guidance based on the new tactical intelligence, their situation growing more desperate with each passing moment. Before we reveal Shadow's true identity, take a moment to like this video if you're Team Skylar. What happens next will change everything these officers think they know about military command. The moment arrived with the suddenness of an explosion as Blake's violent attempt to remove Skylar from the tactical console resulted in the tearing of fabric that had concealed secrets more profound than anyone in the room could have imagined. The sound of ripping cloth cut through the ambient noise of the war room like a blade, and in the sudden silence that followed, every eye focused on what had been revealed. The black triangular spiral tattoo that covered the upper portion of Skylar's chest was not merely decorative body art. It was a geometric pattern of extraordinary complexity and precision, incorporating symbols and markings that spoke of affiliations and capabilities that existed in the deepest shadows of military operations. The Presidential Task Force Omega-3 insignia was embedded within the design like a hidden signature, recognizable only to those who had been briefed on programs that officially did not exist. Admiral Thorne's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips as recognition dawned, his weathered face showing the kind of shock that comes from discovering that reality has been fundamentally different from everything he had believed. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds before tech specialist Morgan, his voice barely above a whisper, gave voice to what several others in the room were thinking, but couldn't bring themselves to say. "Holy cow," he breathed, staring at the revealed tattoo with the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences. "That's Omega-3 marking. I've seen those insignia in classified briefings, but I thought they were theoretical." The implications began to cascade through the assembled officers like a chain reaction, each realization building on the last as they struggled to process what they were seeing. Lieutenant Hayes, her background verification searches suddenly taking on new significance, announced that her security databases were responding to queries about Omega-3 personnel with classification levels that exceeded her clearance. "Admiral, the system is telling me that detailed information about this program requires presidential authorization to access," she reported, her voice showing the strain of someone whose understanding of reality was being systematically dismantled. Major Reeves, staring at the tactical displays that continued to update with intelligence that should have been impossible for any routine analyst to obtain, found himself confronting the possibility that nothing about this situation had been what it appeared to be. Admiral Thorne slowly rose from his position at the head of the conference table, his movements careful and deliberate, as 30 years of military experience processed the significance of what he was witnessing. The Presidential Task Force Omega-3 was more than classified. It was a program that existed in the spaces between official recognition and complete denial, operating with authorities and capabilities that went beyond conventional military structure. "Shadow," he said quietly, the call sign taking on new meaning, as he realized that the woman standing before him represented capabilities and experiences that placed her in a category entirely separate from normal military personnel. "You're the Shadow, Omega-3 Tactical Architect." The admission carried the weight of recognition that extended beyond simple acknowledgement of rank or position. It was an acceptance that the entire dynamic of the war room had shifted in ways that could not be undone. Staff Sergeant Cooper, who had been watching the interaction with growing comprehension, felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place as he remembered classified briefings about operations that had shaped global security without ever appearing in public records. The reactions around the room varied as each officer processed the revelation according to their own background and experience. Captain Blake stumbled backward, his face showing the kind of shock that comes from realizing that everything he thought he understood about the situation had been wrong from the beginning. "That's impossible," he said, his voice lacking the conviction that had characterized his earlier statements. "She's just an analyst. She can't be—" His words trailed off as the evidence before his eyes contradicted every assumption he had made about hierarchy, authority, and the nature of military operations. Lieutenant Hayes, still staring at her computer screen, where classification warnings were multiplying faster than she could read them, found herself confronting the uncomfortable possibility that her background verification efforts had uncovered information that she wasn't authorized to possess. "Admiral, I think I need to step away from this terminal," she said carefully. "The security protocols are warning me that continued access could result in automatic investigation by federal authorities." Tech specialist Morgan, watching intelligence data flow across his screens with a precision and depth that spoke of access to sources beyond anything in his experience, announced that the tactical picture was becoming clearer by the moment. Major Reeves, checking classified databases while trying to verify what his eyes were telling him, announced results that sent another shock through the assembled officers. "Sir, the system is confirming access level presidential authority for an individual designated as Shadow Omega-3 Tactical Architect," he reported, his voice showing the strain of someone whose entire understanding of military hierarchy was being systematically redefined. "According to these records, she has authorization to assume tactical command in circumstances involving national security threats that exceed standard response protocols." The implications of his announcement settled over the war room like a heavy blanket as each officer realized that their dismissive treatment of this quiet analyst had been not merely incorrect, but potentially catastrophic in its misjudgment of capabilities and authority. Staff Sergeant Cooper, comparing the intelligence flowing across his screens with field reports that had seemed hopeless minutes earlier, found himself wondering how many other assumptions about military operations and personnel might be equally wrong. Admiral Thorne, feeling the weight of command shifting in ways he had never experienced before, prepared to confront the reality that some authorities existed beyond his understanding or control. The transformation in Skylar's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. As she straightened from her position at the tactical console, the nervous uncertainty that had characterized her earlier interactions replaced by the calm confidence of someone who had operated in environments where hesitation could prove fatal. "Permission to take command, Admiral," she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that seemed to emanate from experiences that went far beyond conventional military service. The request was delivered without arrogance or aggression, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly what the situation required and possessed the capabilities to provide it. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that the crisis in the field demanded immediate action, while his own understanding of proper procedures had been fundamentally challenged, found himself facing a decision that would define not only the outcome of the current emergency, but his own legacy as a military commander. Around the table, officers who had spent their careers following established chains of command watched as the foundations of everything they thought they understood about military authority shifted beneath their feet like sand in an earthquake. The sound of Blake's chair hitting the floor as he stumbled backward provided a stark counterpoint to the electronic chatter of emergency communications that continued to flow from the threatened base. Lieutenant Hayes, still staring at classification warnings that were multiplying across her screen, found herself torn between curiosity about information that was beyond her clearance level and the professional wisdom that suggested some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. "Admiral," she said carefully, "I think we need to consider the possibility that this entire situation has been orchestrated as some kind of operational test." The suggestion carried implications that went far beyond simple training exercises, suggesting levels of planning and deception that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of military operations and the reliability of information that had seemed unquestionably authentic. Tech specialist Morgan, monitoring communications while trying to process the revelation that had transformed his understanding of everyone present, announced that the intelligence flowing from Skylar's access codes was providing tactical solutions that conventional analysis had missed completely. Advanced military strategy certification programs offer comprehensive training in tactical analysis, command protocols, and strategic decision-making for military professionals seeking specialized qualifications. These intensive courses cover classified operational procedures, leadership development, and advanced tactical planning methods used by elite military units. Providing career advancement opportunities and specialized expertise certification recognized throughout the defense establishment. Major Reeves, coordinating with field units while trying to implement tactical solutions based on intelligence that should have been impossible for any routine analyst to obtain, found himself asking questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about operational security and the compartmentalization of classified information. "Sir, the tactical approaches she's recommending are showing effectiveness rates that exceed anything in our standard playbooks," he reported, his voice showing a mixture of professional admiration and personal confusion. "But these methods aren't documented in any training materials I've ever seen." Staff Sergeant Cooper, working to update defensive protocols based on intelligence that was transforming their understanding of the enemy capabilities, announced that the threatened base was reporting improved tactical conditions for the first time since the crisis had begun. "Admiral, Forward Operating Base Centaur is confirming that the new intelligence is allowing them to establish defensive positions that were invisible under conventional analysis," he said, his voice carrying the first note of genuine optimism since the emergency had started. "Whatever sources she's accessing, they're providing tactical advantages that could save hundreds of lives." The weight of that realization settled over Admiral Thorne like a physical force as he confronted the possibility that his adherence to proper procedures might have cost lives that could have been saved through methods that existed outside conventional understanding. Blake, still staring at the revealed tattoo with the kind of shock that comes from discovering that reality has been fundamentally different from everything he had believed, found his voice long enough to ask the question that was haunting everyone present. "Who are you really?" he said, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching fear. "What is Omega-3, and why don't any of us know about it?" The questions hung in the air like accusations as Skylar turned to face the assembled officers, her green eyes showing a clarity and confidence that made her earlier nervous demeanor seem like an elaborate performance that had served its purpose and was no longer necessary. The revelation of the Omega-3 insignia had transformed the war room from a place of military hierarchy into something resembling a courtroom, where every assumption about authority and capability was being systematically dismantled. Skylar stood perfectly still as the assembled officers processed what they were seeing, her earlier nervous demeanor completely replaced by the calm confidence of someone who had operated in environments where a single mistake could reshape global security. The Presidential Task Force Omega-3 was established to handle threats that exist outside conventional military response protocols, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of experiences that went far beyond anything documented in official records. "We operate in the spaces between what's publicly acknowledged and what's actually necessary to maintain national security." Admiral Thorne felt the foundations of his understanding shifting as he realized that the woman he had dismissed as an unauthorized analyst represented capabilities and authorities that exceeded his own command structure. Staff Sergeant Cooper, monitoring field communications while trying to process the implications of what he was witnessing, announced that the tactical intelligence flowing from her access codes was enabling rescue operations that had seemed impossible minutes earlier. Captain Blake, still staring at the revealed tattoo with the kind of shock that comes from discovering that everything you thought you understood about reality has been fundamentally wrong, found himself confronting the uncomfortable possibility that his entire military career had been built on incomplete information about how security operations actually functioned. "This is impossible," he repeated, though his voice lacked any conviction. "Presidential task forces don't exist. They are conspiracy theories and urban legends." Lieutenant Hayes, her computer screen filled with classification warnings that were multiplying faster than she could read them, found herself torn between professional curiosity and the growing certainty that some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue without proper authorization. "Admiral, my security clearance is being automatically revoked for accessing information about Omega-3 personnel," she reported, her voice showing the strain of someone whose career was being redefined in real time. "The system is telling me that continued access requires direct presidential authorization." Tech specialist Morgan, watching intelligence data flow across his screens with a precision and depth that spoke of sources beyond anything in his experience, announced that the enemy jamming networks were showing systematic vulnerabilities that conventional analysis had completely missed. Major Reeves, coordinating rescue operations while trying to implement tactical solutions based on intelligence that challenged everything he thought he knew about operational capabilities, found himself asking questions that went to the heart of military authority and the nature of classified operations. "Ma'am," he said carefully, addressing Skylar with the respect that her revealed credentials demanded, "if you're Omega-3, then this entire crisis, was it real or was it some kind of operational test?" The question carried implications that extended far beyond simple training exercises, suggesting levels of planning and deception that could reshape understanding about the reliability of intelligence and the nature of threats that shaped global security decisions. Schuyler's response was to pull a black card from her pocket, its surface bearing the presidential seal, along with classification markings that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Operation Cerberus was my design," she said simply, the admission carrying weight that settled over the assembled officers like a physical force. "Every tactical protocol you've been following, every response procedure in your playbooks, every contingency plan in your databases, I wrote them." The silence that followed her revelation lasted exactly 7 seconds before the war room erupted in a chaos of voices, as each officer tried to process what they were hearing. Staff Sergeant Cooper, comparing current tactical procedures with operations he had participated in over the past decade, felt pieces of a massive puzzle clicking into place as he realized that patterns he had attributed to coincidence or superior planning might actually represent the work of a single architect operating behind the scenes. "You've been testing our readiness," he said, his voice showing a mixture of admiration and unease. "This whole crisis, the jamming, the coordinated attacks, you've been evaluating how we respond to scenarios that push us beyond conventional capabilities." Admiral Thorne, feeling the weight of command shifting in ways he had never experienced before, found himself confronting the possibility that his role as tactical commander had been something closer to a performance review than an actual crisis response. Blake, still struggling to reconcile the evidence before his eyes with everything he thought he understood about military operations, demanded answers that challenged the basic assumptions underlying his entire career. Lieutenant Hayes, whose background verification efforts had uncovered information that was transforming her understanding of security classifications and operational authority, suddenly announced results that sent another shock through the assembled officers. "Admiral, I'm showing that Operation Cerberus has been running continuously for the past 18 months, she reported, her voice tight with professional confusion. "According to these records, we've been participating in a comprehensive evaluation of defense capabilities and response protocols without knowing it." The implications of her discovery began to cascade through the room, as each officer realized that their most significant operational experiences might have been carefully orchestrated scenarios designed to test and improve their capabilities. Tech specialist Morgan, monitoring the flow of intelligence that continued to update their understanding of the tactical situation, found himself wondering how many other operations that had seemed like genuine emergencies might actually have been sophisticated training exercises designed to push military capabilities beyond conventional limits. The transformation in Schuyler's bearing became more pronounced as she stepped away from the tactical console, her movements carrying the kind of controlled precision that spoke of training and experience that went far beyond conventional military service. "Permission to debrief the operational assessment, Admiral," she said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to emanate from sources beyond the normal chain of command. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond his understanding of proper procedures, found himself nodding agreement while struggling to process the implications of what he was authorizing. Major Reeves, still coordinating with field units that were reporting improved tactical conditions based on intelligence that shouldn't have existed, announced that the threatened base was successfully implementing extraction procedures that had seemed impossible under conventional analysis. "Sir, Forward Operating Base Centaur is confirming successful evacuation of all personnel," he reported, his voice showing relief mixed with bewilderment. Whatever intelligence sources were accessed, they provided tactical advantages that saved hundreds of lives. Staff Sergeant Cooper, working to update defensive protocols based on information that was reshaping their understanding of enemy capabilities and friendly assets, found himself confronting questions about the nature of military operations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the reliability of intelligence and the authenticity of threats. "Ma'am," he said carefully, addressing Schuyler with the formal respect that her revealed credentials demanded, "if this was an operational test, does that mean the enemy forces weren't real?" The question carried implications that went to the heart of military service and the nature of the threats that justified the existence of defense capabilities. Schuyler's response was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that suggested someone accustomed to briefing officials at the highest levels of government. "The threats were real," she said simply. "The jamming technology, the coordinated attacks, the tactical intelligence demonstrated by hostile forces, All of that represented genuine capabilities that exist in the operational environment. What we controlled was the timing and scope of the engagement to ensure that evaluation objectives could be met without unnecessary casualties. The distinction between real threats and controlled scenarios began to sink in, as the assembled officers realized that they had been participating in something that was simultaneously more and less dangerous than they had understood. Blake, still struggling with the revelation that his dismissive treatment of an apparent analyst had actually been directed towards someone with authority that exceeded his own, found his voice long enough to ask questions that challenged his basic understanding of military hierarchy and operational security. If you have this kind of clearance, this kind of authority, why were you pretending to be a low-level analyst? He demanded, his voice showing the strain of someone whose worldview was being systematically dismantled. Why the deception? Why make us think you were something you weren't? The questions carried undertones of accusation and betrayal, as if the revelation of her true capabilities somehow represented a personal affront to his professional dignity. Schuyler's response was delivered with the kind of patient explanation usually reserved for briefing civilian officials who lacked the background to understand the complexities of security operations. Effective evaluation requires authentic responses, she said calmly. If you had known my actual authority and capabilities, your behavior would have been modified in ways that would have compromised the assessment objectives. We needed to observe how you respond to pressure when you believe you're operating without oversight or safety nets. The clinical nature of her explanation made it clear that the humiliation and frustration experienced by the assembled officers had been not merely anticipated, but deliberately engineered as part of a comprehensive evaluation process. Lieutenant Hayes, still monitoring classification warnings that were reshaping her understanding of security protocols and operational authority, announced that her access to normal intelligence databases was being systematically restricted as the system recognized the presence of personnel with clearances that exceeded standard military hierarchy. Tech specialist Morgan, watching intelligence data continue to flow across his screens while trying to process the implications of what he was witnessing, found himself asking questions about the nature of the technology and capabilities that had been demonstrated. Ma'am, the intelligence sources you accessed, the override codes you used, are those part of standard Omega-3 protocols, or do they represent capabilities that exist outside normal military structure? The question carried implications about the relationship between officially acknowledged military capabilities and the resources that might be available to organizations operating in the shadows of national security. Major Reeves, coordinating final phases of the rescue operation, while trying to understand the scope and purpose of the evaluation they had unknowingly participated in, announced that field units were reporting tactical successes that exceeded anything in their previous operational experience. Sir, the intelligence and coordination we received during this operation has resulted in 0 casualties and complete mission success, he reported, his voice showing a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal bewilderment. The weight of that achievement settled over Admiral Thorne, as he realized that the crisis he had been prepared to accept as a catastrophic failure had been transformed into what might be considered a perfect operational outcome. Staff Sergeant Cooper, monitoring communications while trying to process the revelation that their most challenging operational experience had been a carefully orchestrated evaluation, found himself wondering about the implications for military training and the development of tactical capabilities. Ma'am, he said carefully, if this assessment identified areas where our capabilities need improvement, what happens next? Are there recommendations or changes that will result from what you observed? The question represented more than professional curiosity. It reflected the recognition that their performance during the evaluation might have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. If this story of tactical genius gave you chills, check out our next video about another undercover operative who shocked an entire Navy SEAL team. You won't believe what happens. Schuyler's response was delivered with the kind of measured authority that suggested someone accustomed to making decisions that affected global security policies and resource allocation. The assessment has identified both strengths and vulnerabilities in current defense protocols, she said, moving to the main tactical display where data from the entire operation was being compiled in real time. Your performance under pressure demonstrated exceptional adaptability and resourcefulness. but it also revealed gaps in interagency coordination and communication protocols that could prove critical in actual emergency scenarios. Blake, still processing the revelation that his confrontational behavior had been observed and evaluated as part of a comprehensive assessment of military personnel, found himself wondering whether his career had been damaged by his treatment of someone whose authority exceeded his own understanding of command structure. Lieutenant Hayes, watching classification warnings multiply across her screen as the system recognized the presence of personnel with clearances that operated outside normal military hierarchy, announced that she was being automatically enrolled in enhanced security protocols that would affect her access to intelligence databases for the foreseeable future. The implications of the evaluation began to cascade through each officer's understanding as they realized that their most significant operational experience had been something between a test and a genuine crisis, designed to push their capabilities beyond conventional limits while providing data that would shape future defense policies. Tech specialist Morgan, monitoring the flow of intelligence that had transformed their understanding of the tactical situation, found himself asking questions about the technology and resources that had been employed during the operation. "Ma'am, the jamming technology and electronic warfare capabilities demonstrated during this operation, were those our systems being used for evaluation purposes, or were they actual enemy capabilities that we were being tested against?" The question carried implications about the nature of threats that existed in the operational environment and the level of sophistication that defense systems needed to address. Major Reeves, coordinating final debriefing procedures while trying to understand the scope of the assessment they had participated in, announced that field units were requesting guidance about classification levels for the operation and the intelligence that had been accessed during the crisis response. "Sir, we need guidance about what information from this operation can be included in standard after-action reports," he said, his voice showing the confusion of someone trying to navigate security protocols that operated outside his normal experience. Staff Sergeant Cooper, working to compile operational data while processing the revelation that their most challenging tactical experience had been a carefully orchestrated evaluation, found himself wondering about the implications for military training and the development of defensive capabilities. Admiral Thorne, feeling the weight of command responsibilities that extended beyond his previous understanding of military authority, prepared to ask questions that would define his understanding of his role in the broader context of national security operations. The moment of transition arrived as Skylar assumed the command presence that had been hidden beneath her earlier performance as a nervous analyst, her bearing and voice carrying the authority of someone who operated at levels of government that existed beyond conventional military structure. "Admiral, the assessment phase of Operation Cerberus is complete," she announced, her voice carrying the finality of official conclusion. "The evaluation data will be compiled and submitted to the National Security Council within 72 hours, along with recommendations for enhanced training protocols and resource allocation." Blake, still struggling with the implications of his confrontational behavior towards someone whose authority exceeded his own understanding of command hierarchy, found himself asking questions that reflected his growing awareness that his career might have been fundamentally affected by his performance during the evaluation. Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring security protocols that were reshaping her access to intelligence databases, announced that she was being transferred to enhanced clearance procedures that would affect her duties and responsibilities for the immediate future. The systematic revelation of the true nature of the operation continued as each officer processed the implications of what they had experienced and participated in. Tech specialist Morgan, watching intelligence data that had seemed impossible under conventional analysis, found himself wondering about the relationship between officially acknowledged capabilities and the resources that might be available to organizations operating in the deepest shadows of national security. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the technology and intelligence sources that were demonstrated during this operation, are those representative of capabilities that exist within normal military structure, or do they indicate resources that operate outside conventional defense systems?" The question carried implications about the nature of national security operations and the level of coordination that existed between different agencies and organizations. Major Reeves, coordinating final phases of the debriefing process while trying to understand his role in the broader context of defense evaluation and improvement, announced that field units were reporting complete mission success with operational outcomes that exceeded their previous experience. "Ma'am, The tactical coordination and intelligence support provided during this operation resulted in 0 casualties and complete objective achievement, he reported, his voice showing professional satisfaction mixed with personal curiosity about the methods and resources that had made such success possible. Staff Sergeant Cooper, compiling operational data while processing the scope of the evaluation they had unknowingly participated in, found himself asking questions about the implications for future training and the development of military capabilities that could address threats operating beyond conventional parameters. The transformation of the war room from a crisis management center to a debriefing facility reflected the broader changes in understanding that each officer was experiencing as they processed the revelation of the true nature of their operational experience. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that his role as tactical commander had been observed and evaluated as part of a comprehensive assessment of defense capabilities, found himself asking questions that challenged his understanding of command responsibility and the nature of military authority in the context of national security operations. "B'si Cross," he said formally, using her civilian designation while acknowledging the authority that her revealed credentials represented. "What are the immediate implications of this assessment for our unit and our operational responsibilities?" The question reflected more than professional curiosity. It represented his recognition that the evaluation might have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate operation. Schuyler's response was delivered with the kind of measured precision that suggested someone accustomed to briefing officials at the highest levels of government about matters that affected global security policies and resource allocation. "The assessment has identified areas where enhanced training and coordination protocols could significantly improve operational effectiveness," she said, moving to display data that compiled performance metrics from throughout the operation. "Your unit demonstrated exceptional adaptability under pressure, but the evaluation also revealed vulnerabilities in communication protocols and interagency coordination that could prove critical in actual emergency scenarios." Blake, still processing the implications of his confrontational behavior and its potential impact on his career, found himself wondering whether the evaluation would result in disciplinary action or whether his performance would be considered within acceptable parameters for someone operating under the stress of an apparent crisis. Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring security protocols that were reshaping her access to intelligence databases and her understanding of classification procedures, announced that she was being enrolled in enhanced clearance procedures that would affect her duties and responsibilities for the foreseeable future. "Admiral, I'm being notified that my participation in this operation requires additional security briefings and modified access protocols," she reported, her voice showing the confusion of someone navigating procedures that operated outside her normal experience. Tech specialist Morgan, watching intelligence data that had transformed their understanding of the tactical situation, found himself asking questions about the technology and capabilities that had been demonstrated during the operation and their relationship to officially acknowledged defense systems. The systematic debriefing process continued as Schuyler provided explanations that clarified the scope and purpose of the evaluation, while revealing the broader context of national security operations that existed beyond conventional military structure. The Omega-3 program was established to address threats that operate outside the parameters of conventional defense responses, she explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had participated in the creation and implementation of policies that shaped global security operations. "Our primary mission is to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of existing defense capabilities while developing new protocols for addressing emerging threats that challenge traditional military and intelligence approaches." Major Reeves, coordinating final phases of the operational debriefing while trying to understand the implications for future training and capability development, announced that the intelligence and coordination demonstrated during the operation had resulted in tactical outcomes that exceeded anything in their previous operational experience. Staff Sergeant Cooper, compiling performance data while processing the revelation that their most challenging operational experience had been a carefully orchestrated evaluation designed to test and improve military capabilities, found himself asking questions about the relationship between training exercises and actual crisis response. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "given that this operation combined real threats with controlled scenarios, how do we distinguish between training and actual emergencies in future operations?" The question reflected more than professional curiosity. It represented his recognition that the boundaries between evaluation and genuine crisis might not always be clear, with implications for how military personnel should respond to apparent threats and emergency situations. The complexity of that question highlighted one of the fundamental challenges facing military and intelligence operations in an environment where threats could be manufactured, manipulated, or enhanced for evaluation purposes without necessarily being artificial or safe. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that his understanding of command responsibility and operational authority had been fundamentally challenged by the revelation of capabilities and authorities that existed beyond his normal experience, found himself asking questions that went to the heart of military hierarchy and the nature of national security operations. Ms. Cross, what is the command relationship between Omega-3 personnel and conventional military authority? He asked, his voice showing the careful respect of someone who understood that he was operating in unfamiliar territory where normal protocols might not apply. Schuyler's response was delivered with the kind of diplomatic precision that suggested extensive experience in explaining complex authority relationships to officials who operated within conventional government structure. Omega-3 operates under direct presidential authority with coordination responsibilities that extend across all branches of military and intelligence services, she said, her voice carrying the weight of official policy. Our personnel are authorized to assume operational command when circumstances require capabilities or authorities that exceed conventional response protocols, but we coordinate with existing command structures whenever possible to maintain operational effectiveness and institutional relationships. The explanation clarified some aspects of the authority demonstration they had witnessed, while raising additional questions about the scope and limitations of capabilities that operated outside normal military hierarchy. Blake, still processing the implications of his confrontational behavior towards someone whose authority exceeded his understanding of command structure, found himself asking questions that reflected his growing awareness that his performance during the evaluation might have consequences for his career and his understanding of military operations. Ma'am, given that my behavior during this operation was inappropriate, what are the implications for my continued service and my unit's operational status? The question carried undertones of concern about disciplinary action and career consequences, but it also reflected his recognition that the evaluation had revealed aspects of his leadership and decision-making that might require modification or improvement. Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring security protocols that continued to reshape her access to intelligence databases and her understanding of classification procedures, announced that she was receiving briefing assignments that would modify her duties and responsibilities based on her participation in the Omega-3 evaluation. Admiral, I'm being assigned to enhanced coordination training that will modify my role in future operations, she reported, her voice showing a mixture of professional interest and personal uncertainty about the implications for her career development. Tech specialist Morgan, watching intelligence data that had transformed their understanding of tactical capabilities and operational possibilities, found himself asking questions about the technology and resources that had been demonstrated during the operation and their availability for future military operations. The broader implications of the evaluation began to emerge as each officer processed the scope of the assessment and its potential impact on military training, capability development, and operational procedures. Major Reeves, coordinating final phases of the debriefing process while trying to understand the relationship between the evaluation and broader defense policies, announced that field units were requesting guidance about the classification and documentation of their operational experience. Ma'am, we need direction about how this operation should be recorded in official databases and what information can be included in standard after-action reports, he said, his voice showing the practical concerns of someone trying to navigate security protocols that operated outside normal military procedures. Staff Sergeant Cooper, compiling performance data while processing the revelation that their operational experience had been designed to test and improve military capabilities, found himself wondering about the implications for future training and the development of tactical procedures that could address threats operating beyond conventional parameters. Ma'am, he said carefully, based on the assessment results, what changes should we expect in our training protocols and operational procedures? The question reflected more than professional curiosity. It represented his recognition that the evaluation might lead to significant modifications in how military units prepared for and responded to crisis situations. The systematic nature of the evaluation became more apparent as Schuyler provided explanations that revealed the comprehensive scope of the assessment and its integration with broader national security policies and resource allocation decisions. The data collected during this operation will be analyzed in conjunction with similar evaluations conducted across multiple military and intelligence organizations, she explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who participated in policy decisions that affected global security operations. The results will inform the recommendations for enhanced training protocols, improved coordination procedures, and resource allocation adjustments that will strengthen overall defense capabilities. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that his unit's performance had been evaluated as part of a broader assessment of national defense capabilities, found himself asking questions about the timeline and scope of changes that might result from the evaluation. The moment of final transition arrived as Schuyler prepared to conclude the debriefing and return to whatever operational responsibilities awaited her beyond the war room. Blake, still processing the implications of the revelation and his own performance during the evaluation, found himself asking questions that reflected his growing understanding of the complexity of national security operations and the existence of capabilities that operated beyond conventional military structure. "Ma'am, for someone at my level, someone who will continue serving in conventional military roles, what should I understand about Omega-3 and operations like this?" The question carried implications about operational security and the level of knowledge that was appropriate for personnel who would return to normal military duties after participating in specialized evaluations. Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring final security protocols while processing the implications of her participation in an operation that had revealed capabilities and authorities beyond her previous experience, announced that she was completing enhanced clearance procedures that would affect her future access to intelligence databases and her understanding of classification protocols. Tech specialist Morgan, watching intelligence data that had demonstrated capabilities beyond anything in his normal experience, found himself asking questions about the relationship between the technology and resources that had been employed during the operation and the systems that were available for conventional military operations. The comprehensive nature of the evaluation and its implications for future military capabilities became clear as Schuyler provided final explanations that placed the operation in the broader context of national security strategy and defense policy development. Operations like this are conducted periodically to ensure that our defense capabilities remain effective against evolving threats and that our personnel are prepared to respond to situations that may exceed conventional parameters, she said, her voice carrying the weight of official policy and strategic planning. Your performance during this evaluation demonstrated both the strengths of current training and procedures and areas where improvements could enhance operational effectiveness. Major Reeves, coordinating final phases of the debriefing while processing the scope of the assessment and its potential impact on future operations, announced that field units were completing final documentation procedures based on guidance that would maintain operational security while preserving valuable tactical lessons from the operation. Staff Sergeant Cooper, compiling performance data while understanding the evaluation's role in improving military capabilities, found himself appreciating the complexity of the assessment and its integration with broader defense policies and strategic planning. The transformation of understanding that each officer had experienced during the operation reflected the broader challenge of maintaining effective defense capabilities in an environment where threats could evolve beyond conventional parameters and where the boundaries between training and actual crisis might not always be clearly defined. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that his role as tactical commander had been evaluated as part of a comprehensive assessment of defense capabilities, found himself with a new appreciation for the complexity of national security operations and the existence of resources and authorities that operated beyond his normal experience. As the debriefing concluded and normal war room operations prepared to resume, the assembled officers found themselves changed by their participation in an evaluation that had challenged their understanding of military hierarchy, operational capabilities, and the nature of threats that shaped national security policies. Blake, still processing the implications of his performance and the revelation of capabilities that had exceeded his understanding, found himself with a new respect for the complexity of operations that existed beyond conventional military structure. Lieutenant Hayes, completing enhanced security procedures that reflected her participation in the specialized evaluation, recognized that her future responsibilities would be influenced by her experience with capabilities and authorities that operated outside normal military hierarchy. The final moment of transition arrived as Skylar prepared to leave the war room, her mission complete and her evaluation concluded. But the implications of the operation would continue to influence the understanding and capabilities of the personnel who had participated. Tech specialist Morgan, monitoring systems that had demonstrated capabilities beyond his previous experience, found himself with enhanced appreciation for the technology and resources that supported national security operations beyond conventional military structure. Major Reeves, coordinating final operational procedures while processing the scope of the assessment, recognized that his understanding of tactical capabilities and coordination procedures had been fundamentally enhanced by his participation in the evaluation. Staff Sergeant Cooper, compiling final performance data while understanding the evaluation's role in improving defense capabilities, found himself with new appreciation for the complexity of national security operations and the resources required to maintain effective responses to evolving threats. The systematic nature of the assessment and its integration with broader policy development reflected the comprehensive approach required to maintain national security in an environment where threats could exceed conventional parameters and where effective defense required capabilities and authorities that operated beyond normal military structure. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that his command experience had been enhanced by participation in an evaluation that had challenged his understanding of operational capabilities and command authority, found himself with new respect for the complexity of national security operations and the personnel who operated in the shadows to maintain effective defense capabilities. The revelation of Omega-3 and its role in evaluating and improving military capabilities had provided insights into the broader structure of national security operations and the resources required to address threats that exceeded conventional parameters. As normal operations resumed in the war room, the assembled officers carried with them enhanced understanding of the complexity of national security operations and the existence of capabilities and authorities that operated beyond conventional military structure. The evaluation had achieved its objectives of testing and improving military capabilities while providing valuable data for policy development and resource allocation decisions that would strengthen overall defense effectiveness. The encrypted communication that interrupted the conclusion of the debriefing carried the distinctive tone that indicated priority traffic from sources that operated at the highest levels of national security authority. Skylar's response to the incoming transmission demonstrated the kind of immediate transition that characterized personnel who operated in environments where global security situations could develop without warning and require immediate response from specialized capabilities. "Shadow, we have a situation developing in the South China Sea," came the voice through the secure channel, carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to briefing operations that would never appear in public records. "Multiple carrier groups have gone off communications, and satellite intelligence indicates coordinated movement of unidentified naval assets in international waters." The nature of the new crisis immediately shifted the atmosphere in the war room, as each officer recognized the implications of a situation that involved multiple carrier groups and coordinated naval movements in one of the world's most strategically sensitive regions. Admiral Thorne, still processing the implications of the evaluation they had just completed, found himself wondering whether this new crisis represented another assessment scenario or a genuine emergency that would require immediate response from conventional military capabilities. Skylar's reaction to the incoming intelligence suggested that the situation represented a level of threat that exceeded routine monitoring and required immediate attention from resources that operated beyond normal military structure. "This isn't random," she said after reviewing the initial intelligence summary, her voice carrying the kind of analytical precision that had characterized her performance throughout the evaluation. "Someone's testing our response patterns, evaluating how we react to coordinated threats against multiple high-value assets simultaneously." Blake, still processing the revelation of her true capabilities and authority, found himself asking questions about the relationship between the completed evaluation and this new crisis development. "Ma'am, is this new situation connected to the assessment we just participated in, or does it represent a separate threat that requires different response protocols?" The question reflected his growing understanding that threats and evaluations might be interconnected in ways that weren't immediately apparent to personnel operating within conventional military structure. Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring intelligence feeds while processing the implications of the new crisis for the personnel and resources that had just completed a comprehensive evaluation, announced that preliminary analysis suggested coordination between multiple threat actors operating with sophisticated intelligence about Allied naval operations and response procedures. Tech specialist Morgan, analyzing electronic signatures and communication patterns associated with the South China Sea situation, found evidence of capabilities that exceeded anything in current threat databases and suggested the involvement of resources that operated beyond conventional military or intelligence organization. The complexity of the developing situation became apparent as intelligence continued to flow from sources that revealed the scope and sophistication of whatever forces were responsible for the coordinated action against multiple carrier groups. Major Reeves, coordinating initial response protocols while trying to understand the relationship between the completed evaluation and this new crisis, announced that standard communication and coordination procedures were showing limited effectiveness against whatever capabilities were being employed in the South China Sea operation. Staff Sergeant Cooper, monitoring tactical intelligence while processing the implications of a situation that involved multiple high-value assets and coordinated threat actions, found himself asking questions about the resources and authorities that would be required to address a crisis that exceeded conventional response parameters. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "given the scope of this situation and the capabilities that appear to be involved, what level of response authority will be required to address this threat effectively?" The question reflected his growing understanding that some situations required resources and authorities that operated outside normal military hierarchy and conventional response protocols. Schuyler's analysis of the South China Sea intelligence revealed patterns that suggested the involvement of capabilities and planning that went far beyond conventional military or terrorist organization, indicating the possible involvement of state-level resources operating with sophisticated intelligence about Allied procedures and capabilities. "Admiral," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who operated with resources that exceeded conventional military structure, "this situation is going to require coordination between multiple agencies and the activation of response protocols that operate beyond standard military authority." Admiral Thorne, recognizing that the new crisis represented challenges that exceeded his normal operational experience, found himself asking questions about the command structure and resource allocation that would be required to address threats that operated beyond conventional parameters. The systematic nature of the South China Sea situation became apparent as intelligence analysis revealed coordination between multiple threat actors operating with capabilities and planning that suggested extensive preparation and sophisticated understanding of Allied response procedures. Blake, still processing the implications of the completed evaluation and its relationship to this new crisis, found himself wondering whether his unit would have a role in the response, or whether the situation would be handled by resources that operated beyond conventional military structure. Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring classification protocols while processing intelligence about a situation that exceeded her normal clearance level, announced that she was receiving automated notifications about enhanced security procedures and modified access protocols that reflected the sensitive nature of the developing crisis. Tech specialist Morgan, analyzing electronic warfare signatures and communication patterns associated with the South China Sea operation, found evidence of capabilities that suggested the involvement of resources and technology that operated beyond anything in current threat databases. The broader implications of the South China Sea situation began to emerge as intelligence analysis revealed the scope of coordination and the sophistication of capabilities that had been employed against multiple high-value Allied assets simultaneously. Major Reeves, coordinating initial response protocols while understanding the limitations of conventional military resources against threats that operated beyond normal parameters, announced that the situation would require coordination with agencies and resources that existed beyond standard military hierarchy. Staff Sergeant Cooper, monitoring tactical intelligence while processing the implications of a coordinated threat against multiple carrier groups, found himself appreciating the complexity of national security operations and the resources required to address situations that exceeded conventional response capabilities. The revelation that such threats could develop without warning and require immediate response from specialized resources highlighted the importance of evaluations, like the one they had just completed, and the need for enhanced coordination between different levels of military and intelligence organization. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that the South China Sea situation represented challenges that exceeded his normal command authority and operational experience, found himself asking questions about the timeline and coordination requirements for addressing threats that operated beyond conventional military parameters. "Ms. Cross," he said formally, "what are the immediate requirements for responding to this situation, and what role should conventional military resources play in coordinated response efforts?" The question reflected his understanding that the crisis would require resources and authorities that operated beyond his normal experience, while recognizing the need for coordination between different levels of national security organization. Schuyler's response demonstrated the kind of systematic analysis that characterized personnel who operated at the intersection of multiple agencies and authorities, evaluating threats and coordinating responses that exceeded the capabilities of any single organization. The South China Sea situation will require immediate activation of interagency coordination protocols and the deployment of specialized resources that operate under direct National Security Council authority, she explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who participated in policy decisions that affected global security operations. Conventional military resources will provide essential support and coordination, but the primary response will be handled by organizations that operate beyond standard military structure. The systematic nature of the response requirements became apparent as Schuyler provided explanations that revealed the complexity of addressing threats that operated beyond conventional parameters and required coordination between multiple agencies and specialized resources. Blake, processing the implications of the situation for his continued role in military operations, found himself with enhanced understanding of the complexity of national security operations and the existence of resources and authorities that operated beyond his normal experience. Lieutenant Hayes, completing enhanced security procedures while processing the implications of the South China Sea situation for her future responsibilities, recognized that her participation in the evaluation had provided valuable experience that would influence her role in future coordination efforts between conventional military and specialized security resources. Tech specialist Morgan, monitoring intelligence feeds while understanding the technology and capabilities that had been demonstrated during both the evaluation and the developing crisis, found himself with enhanced appreciation for the complexity of national security operations and the resources required to address evolving threats. The final transition moment arrived as Schuyler prepared to leave the war room to address the South China Sea situation, her evaluation mission complete, but her operational responsibilities continuing in response to threats that required immediate attention from specialized resources and authorities. Major Reeves, coordinating final operational procedures while processing the implications of both the completed evaluation and the developing crisis, recognized that his understanding of tactical coordination and response procedures had been fundamentally enhanced by his participation in operations that exceeded conventional military parameters. Staff Sergeant Cooper, compiling final performance data while understanding the relationship between evaluation and response to genuine threats, found himself with new appreciation for the complexity of maintaining effective defense capabilities in an environment where threats could evolve rapidly and require immediate response from resources that operated beyond conventional military structure. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that his command experience had been enhanced by participation in operations that challenged his understanding of military authority and capability, found himself with enhanced respect for the personnel who operated in the shadows to maintain effective national security responses to threats that exceeded conventional parameters. As Schuyler gathered her materials and prepared to transition to addressing the South China Sea crisis, her final words to the assembled officers reflected the ongoing nature of national security operations and the continuous requirement for evaluation and improvement of capabilities that supported effective defense against evolving threats. "Admiral, cancel all leave," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the scope of the challenges that lay ahead. "We're going to need everyone for what's coming. The statement carried implications that extended beyond the immediate South China Sea situation, suggesting broader challenges that would require coordination between conventional military resources and specialized capabilities that operated beyond normal organizational structure. The transformation of understanding that each officer had experienced during the evaluation and the revelation of the South China Sea crisis reflected the complex reality of national security operations in an environment where threats could exceed conventional parameters and require immediate response from resources and authorities that operated beyond normal military hierarchy. Their participation in the evaluation had provided valuable experience and enhanced understanding that would influence their effectiveness in future operations, whether those involved routine military activities or specialized coordination with resources that existed in the shadows of national security operations. As normal war room operations resumed, with enhanced understanding of the complexity and scope of national security challenges, the assembled officers carried with them new appreciation for the resources and personnel who operated beyond conventional military structure to maintain effective defense capabilities against threats that could evolve beyond traditional parameters. The evaluation had achieved its objectives while providing valuable preparation for the ongoing challenges that would require coordination between multiple levels of organization and authority to address effectively. The encrypted phone continued to deliver updates about the South China Sea situation as Schuyler prepared to leave, each transmission adding complexity to a crisis that would require immediate response from the full spectrum of national security resources and capabilities. The officers who remained in the war room would continue their essential mission of supporting conventional military operations while maintaining enhanced awareness of the broader context of threats and responses that shaped global security in ways that often remained invisible to public attention, but were essential to maintaining the stability and security that enabled peaceful civilian life to continue without interruption. The war room fell into a profound silence as Schuyler's final command hung in the air, like an unspoken promise of challenges yet to come. Admiral Thorne found himself staring at the tactical displays that had returned to routine monitoring patterns, but the data streaming across the screens now carried new significance after witnessing capabilities that operated beyond his previous understanding of military authority. Blake remained seated at his position, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by the kind of sobering realization that comes from discovering that everything you thought you understood about reality has been fundamentally incomplete. Staff Sergeant Cooper broke the silence first, his voice carrying the practical concerns of someone who understood that operational demands would continue regardless of the revelations they had just experienced. "Admiral, should we begin implementing the enhanced coordination protocols that were discussed during the debriefing?" he asked, recognizing that the evaluation had identified specific areas where their capabilities could be improved. Major Reeves nodded in agreement while monitoring communications that were already showing increased traffic related to the South China Sea situation, though the details remained classified beyond their current access level. Lieutenant Hayes, still processing the security briefings that had modified her clearance status, announced that she was receiving training assignments that would prepare her for future coordination with specialized agencies and resources. "Sir, it appears that our participation in the evaluation has qualified us for enhanced cooperation protocols with organizations that operate beyond standard military structure," she reported, her voice showing a mixture of professional interest and personal uncertainty about the implications for her career development. Tech specialist Morgan, watching intelligence feeds that continued to update with fragments of information about global security situations, found himself with new appreciation for the complexity of the threats that existed beyond public awareness and the resources required to address them effectively. The technology and capabilities that had been demonstrated during the evaluation represented only a small fraction of what was apparently available to personnel who operated at the intersection of multiple agencies and authorities. Admiral Thorne, recognizing that his command responsibilities had been fundamentally expanded by his unit's participation in the Omega-3 evaluation, prepared to address the immediate question of how they would integrate the lessons learned into their ongoing operational duties. "We proceed with enhanced readiness," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that they had been prepared for challenges that exceeded conventional military parameters. "And we remember that some of the most important battles are fought by people whose names never appear in the history books." As the war room returned to its routine monitoring functions, each officer carried with them the knowledge that national security operated on levels of complexity and capability that remained invisible to most of the world, maintained by personnel who sacrificed recognition for effectiveness and operated in shadows to preserve the light that enabled civilian life to continue in peace and security.